Divided Lives is a book about the often forgotten victims of the Holocaust. They're people from mixed marriages, from Jewish-Christian mixed marriages who survived the Third Reich. And they're called Mischlinge, which means half-breeds. It was a term that Hitler gave to those who were considered between half man and half ape. If you were first-degree Mischlinge, then you had 2 Jewish grandparents, and you were considered half Jewish. If you were second-degree Mischlinge, you had 1 Jewish grandparent, and you were called a quarter Jew. The first degree were closer to being real Jews. They fell under the Nuremberg laws, so all the anti-Jewish legislation that followed the Nuremberg laws in 1935, they fell under those laws, where they couldn't go to school anymore, they couldn't see their friends who were considered German, because they weren't considered German anymore, they were considered Jewish now. And slowly all their rights were taken away. I was inspired by the stories of my grandmother. She had written a memoir, and I'd been trying to get that memoir out of her basement for years, and she finally gave it to me to work on. So originally, I started working on her manuscript, just contextualizing it, anglicizing it, because she had written it in the 50s and had just thrown it in the basement. So I was working on that when I was in Germany and decided that I wanted to find out more about these mixed marriages. And there was hardly anything written about them. I am not Jewish. I'm Presbyterian, like my father and my mother. And my grandfather is not Jewish, which is important to understand for this book, because the book starts with them. It starts out as a memoir and then goes into 10 women's stories. But my grandfather came from a Jewish background. Therefore, he had a Jewish bloodline, as Hitler would call it. Therefore, he was Jewish. But he didn't know anything about the religion. He'd never practiced. But because of that line, and his last name was Cohn, which means priest, which is a Jewish name, he was considered Jewish. My grandfather left in 1938 before Kristallnacht, so he wasn't in a camp, but his 2 brothers were. Well, one was in a prison, one was taken to a camp. And my grandmother helped one of his brothers get out. And that whole year, then that my grandparents were separated, and my grandmother had to go and get all the documents, which ended up being 12 to 20 documents before she could leave. And so she was running around in the middle of the night at times trying to get all these documents together. And eventually she got out with her 4 kids. Reading
several of the chapters of Divided Lives brought back memories for me, and some of the thought processes and concerns that these women had. And it welled up some of the hatred I acquired for the Nazis. My mother had to take me out of school. I came home bloody all the time. And I was a little runt of a kid in the first place, so I couldn't protect myself against the class bullies. So I was pulled out of school about 3-4 months before we came to the United States, till all the papers were in order and what have you. The beatings that I got regularly, the slapping by my teacher for no reason at all, to emphasize what a great Nazi he was, because all the kids around me were encouraged to tell stories on each other if they were protecting a Jew or playing with a Jew or whatever. Well, I didn't know what a Jew was. And, it became obvious what it was to me, but it created in me that I was never going to tolerate that again.
Every single person had a different story or different twist on a story. That was fascinating to me, and I think that it's fascinating to readers, because when I first started the book, people would ask, well, didn't they all experience the same persecution? I said, no, they all had very different stories. I always remember Ruth Yost because she was my first interview of a Mischling. Her father was Jewish, and she was the only one who grew up going to a synagogue, and her mother was Lutheran. And as she says, her mother tried to educate out of her all that was Jewish. but she was very tied to her father and did not have a very good relationship with her mother. So when he left, he tried to escape. Then he was caught and ended up fighting with Rommel. So that eventually, toward the end of the war, he ended up in England and never came back to Germany. So for her, this broke her heart when she was 8 years old and started the path that she couldn't get over. I researched divided lives over a period of 8 years. And it took about 6 to 7 months to even find the people that I started to talk to. They were very mistrustful. It's this fear that nobody can understand that leaves its mark. You know, you're not sure if you can trust people. You don't know what repercussions there are going to be. If you live in a country for 12 years and you can hardly talk to anyone on the street and you can't tell anybody your secrets, you can't even say, if you say one wrong thing, you could end up in jail, you could end up dead. We don't have an idea of what that feels like, to just not be able to say what we feel anytime that we like. It was dangerous. I hope that when people are finished reading Divided Lives that they feel hopeful about human nature and know that even under the worst circumstances that people can find ways to cope and survive. So ultimately I think this is about hope and belief in the human spirit. What makes Divided Lives different from other books about the Holocaust is that I believe it goes beyond the Holocaust. I think that we're looking at divisions and splits in life that occur, identity splits between Jewish and Christian, Gentile Jew, however you want to look at it. Americans can relate to it because there's so much of this that's going on right now, where there's Jewish, Christian mixed marriages and people who are dealing with that. And where do I fit in? What's my identity in this situation? Divided Lives is for a mix of people. I do not think it's just a Jewish book or a Christian book or a man's book or a woman's book. I think it crosses religious lines, gender, ethnicity, race, because it's about all of us.